Good evening, everyone. Before the stories begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. The more you engage, the more these chilling tales will return to your feed. Now, let's step into the dark together. I met him because I was lonely in a city that pretended not to notice people like me. That is the part one hates admitting out loud. Nothing bad ever starts with danger. It starts with convenience, with timing, with someone appearing right when your life has gone quiet enough that you start answering questions you normally would not. This happened when I was 28, living in a narrow apartment in Tacoma, Washington. The kind of place where the walls were thin and the parking lot lights buzzed all night like insects that never died. I had just moved there for a logistics job I barely cared about. And most of my days followed the same dull loop. Wake up, commute, work, microwave dinner, scroll until sleep.
We need to discuss the timeline. I agree, the delays are concerning. Let's review the resources.
I remember realizing one night that if I disappeared, it might take days before anyone noticed. That is when Aaron introduced himself. I was coming back from work later than usual, carrying a grocery bag that was cutting.
We need to discuss the timeline. I agree, the delays are concerning. Let's review the resources.
My first thought was that someone was trying to steal my catalytic converter. My heart jumped into my throat. I stopped walking and just stood there, watching him from a distance, trying to decide if I should run or yell. He looked up immediately like he had been waiting for me to show up.
You can't run from this.
He smiled and raised both hands, palms out like he already knew
I'll have a gin
what I
and
was
tonic,
thinking.
please.
Sure, coming right up.
He said, "Hey, sorry to scare you, man. Your tire looked a little low, and I figured I would let you know before it became a bigger problem." His voice was calm and friendly, not rushed. He stood up slowly, giving me space, and backed away from my car. I checked the tire. It did look low. I felt stupid for jumping to conclusions. I thanked him and that should have been the end of it. Instead, he asked me how long I had lived there, then what I did for work, then whether the unit above mine was still vacant. It felt natural, easy, like talking to someone you already know. He told me he had moved in 2 weeks earlier, just across the lot, and that he worked nights doing freelance IT stuff. He said, nights messed with your head if you were not careful. I laughed and said days were not much better. He helped me top off the tire with a portable compressor he kept in his trunk. I noticed how prepared he was. Tools neatly organized, clean interior, no clutter. The kind of person who looked like they had their life under control. Before we went our separate ways, he said, "If you ever need anything, I am around. I am up when most people are asleep." That might come in handy. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. Over the next couple of weeks, Aaron kept appearing in my routine. Not in a creepy way, just enough to feel like coincidence. He was in the laundry room when I went down late one night. He was locking his door when I came home early one morning. He always greeted me by name, even though I did not remember telling him mine more than once. One night, he knocked on my door holding a small package. He said the delivery driver had dropped it outside his unit by mistake. It was mine. I had ordered a phone charger and forgotten about it. I thanked him again and this time he lingered. He asked if I wanted to come over for a beer. I hesitated. I am not usually that guy, but the hallway behind me felt empty, and the thought of going back into my silent apartment made my chest feel tight, so I, music, said, sure. His place was almost identical to mine, but it felt different, cleaner, less lived in. The furniture was minimal but deliberate. No personal photos, no decorations, just a couch, a desk with multiple monitors, music, and a bookshelf filled with technical manuals and notebooks. Everything was organized to a level that made my own apartment feel sloppy by comparison. We talked for hours about work, about how hard it was to make friends as an adult, about how cities were full of people who never really saw each other. He listened closely. He remembered details. When I mentioned my sister lived in Portland, he asked later how she was doing, even though I had not brought her up again. Music, that night, when I went back to my apartment, I felt lighter, less invisible. That was the first mistake. After that, music, Aaron became my closest friend without me ever making a conscious decision for that to happen. He knew my schedule better than I realized. He would text me just as I was getting off work asking if I wanted to grab food. Clear's throat, he knew which nights I stayed up late, music, which days I worked from home, which weekends I usually did nothing at all. I told myself that was normal. Friends notice things. Friends pay attention. But there were moments that made me pause, like the time he asked why I had stopped going to the gym on Tuesdays. I do not remember telling him my gym schedule or the time he casually mentioned that my living room light flickered sometimes around midnight. That was inside my apartment. I asked him how he knew that and he laughed and said the wiring in the building was bad and sometimes the light from under my door changed when it happened. I believed him. I wanted to. One Friday night, he invited me over to watch a game. I showed up with takeout and he seemed surprised by the timing, like I had interrupted something. There was a notebook on his desk that he closed quickly when he saw me looking. I caught a glimpse of my name written on the page before he shut it. I asked him about it, jokingly. He said he kept notes on everyone he worked with so he did not forget things. He said his memory was not as good as music, used to be. The game played in the background, but I could not focus. I kept thinking about that notebook, about how my name looked so deliberate on the page, not scribbled, not casual. Later that night, when I went home, I noticed something else. My apartment door was unlocked. I stood there for a long time before going inside, listening for sounds. Everything looked normal. Nothing was missing. No drawers open, no signs of a struggle. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it. I was tired, distracted, music, human. Still, I slept with my bedroom door locked for the first time since moving in. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Aaron asking if I had slept okay. He added a smiley face at the end. I stared at my phone longer than I should have. That was when the feeling started. The one you get when you realize something is off, but you cannot explain it without music, sounding paranoid. The kind of feeling that makes you question your own instincts. I wish I had listened to it then, because by the time I understood what kind of friend Aaron really was, it was already too late to pretend I was alone in my apartment anymore. The first thing I did after that night was start paying attention in a way I never had before. Not the dramatic kind where you jump at shadows, but the quiet kind where you log things mentally and pretend you are not scared yet. I told myself I was just being cautious, that I was an adult living alone and this was normal. It did not feel normal. Small things started standing out once I looked for them. My trash bag felt lighter one morning, like something had been removed. The couch pillow on the far end of my living room was angled differently than I remembered leaving it. My bathroom mirror had faint streaks near the edges, like it had been wiped down recently, even though I had not cleaned it in days. Each thing on its own meant nothing. Together, they made my apartment feel like it had been borrowed. I stopped inviting Aaron over. I stopped responding immediately to his texts. I told him work was getting hectic, which was not even a lie. He did not push back, but I noticed he started running into me more often again in the parking lot near my door outside the building late at night. One evening, I came home and found him sitting on the curb near my car, scrolling on his phone. He looked up and smiled like nothing had changed. He said he had been locked out and was waiting for maintenance. I asked why he did not just go to music, his unit, and wait there. He said his door was acting weird again. Again, I let that slide, too. That night, I woke up around 3 o'clock in the morning to the sound of my name being spoken quietly, not whispered, not loud, just said like someone checking if I was awake. I sat up in bed so fast my head spun. The apartment was dark and silent. I told myself it was a dream. That stress does strange things to your brain. I stayed awake until sunrise. Anyway, the next day I called my sister and told her everything, downplaying the parts that sounded crazy. She told me to trust my gut and maybe invest in a camera or two. I ordered one that afternoon along with a deadbolt upgrade. The camera arrived 2 days later. I installed it in the corner of my living room, angled toward the front door. It connected to my phone and sent motion alerts. Just knowing it was there made me feel a little better. That night, I slept. The next morning, I woke up to 3 notifications. Motion detected at 2:14 a.m. Motion detected at 2:17 a.m. Motion detected at 2:22 a.m. My hand shook as I opened the footage. The first clip showed my front door slowly opening inward. The second showed someone stepping inside. Aaron. He moved like he had done this before. No hesitation, no searching. He did not turn on the lights. He walked straight to the camera, reached up and tilted it toward the ceiling so it could no longer see the room. The third clip showed nothing, just audio. I heard him breathing close, calm. Then his voice, quiet and steady, filled my phone speaker. He said, "I knew you would check this eventually." I did not scream. I did not move. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, listening to the silence of my apartment like it might betray him if I waited long enough. I did not go home that night. I stayed at a motel across town and called the police in the morning. They came with me to the apartment. The door showed no signs of forced entry. When I told them about Aaron, they knocked on his door. The unit was empty. Not recently vacated. Empty like it had never been lived in. No furniture, music, no electronics, no personal items, just bare walls and carpet with faint square impressions where something heavy had once Saturday. Management told the police no one by that name was on the lease. No freelance IT worker, no Aaron. When I packed my things later that week, I found the notebook. It was inside my mattress, slipped between the springs and fabric. Every page was about me, my schedule, my habits, what time I slept, what time I woke up, notes about my sister, my job, my moods. There were entries dated weeks before I ever met him. The last page had a single sentence written neatly in pen. He wrote, "You only notice when you stop being lonely." I moved out of Tacoma 2 days later. I do not accept invitations from strangers anymore. I do not talk to people just because they are friendly. And I do not trust convenience when it shows up at the worst possible time. Because sometimes the new friend you think saved you from loneliness was just waiting for you to feel alone enough to let them in. I did not meet him in person. That is what makes this harder to explain without people assuming I am exaggerating. We met online through a fitness accountability group I joined after my doctor warned me my blood pressure was climbing faster than it should for someone my age. Music, I was 32, recently divorced, living alone in a rented townhouse outside Dayton, Ohio. Most of my friendships had dissolved quietly with the marriage. Not through fights, just distance. Everyone already had their lives sorted. I did not. The group was supposed to be simple. Music, daily check-ins, meal photos, workout logs, encouragement, music, no personal stuff. That rule lasted maybe a week before people started oversharing. Anyway, his username was JustMarkT. Nothing flashy, no profile picture, just a generic silhouette. He commented on my first post within minutes. Told me, good job for showing up. Told me consistency mattered more than intensity. It sounded like something a trainer would say, but it did not feel rehearsed. We started replying to each other more often than anyone else. Not flirting, not trauma dumping, just routine, music, support. If I posted a run, he asked how my knees held up. If I skipped a day, he did not guilt me. He said, tomorrow counts, too. After a few weeks, he messaged me privately asking if I wanted to keep each other accountable off the app. I hesitated, music, then agreed. It felt harmless, motivational, adult. We texted every day after that. What I remember most clearly is how little he asked about my personal life. No probing questions, no curiosity about my past. He did not ask where I worked, did not ask where I lived, did not ask for photos. At the time, that felt respectful. Now I understand it differently. He never needed to ask. He knew when I woke up because I always logged my morning weigh in around the same time. He knew when I got home because that was when I logged dinner. He knew which days I worked late, which weekends I stayed in, which nights I drank more water because I had been out drinking. One night after I mentioned being sore from leg day, he told me to stretch my hip flexors before bed because they tighten when you sit too long during the day. I asked how he knew I had a desk job. He said most people do. I accepted that. The first time something felt wrong was when I stopped posting for 2 days. I was sick, music, fever, headache. I stayed in bed and ignored my phone. When I finally checked it, I had 11 messages from Mark. Not panicked, not frantic, concerned. He said he noticed I missed my check-ins. Asked if I was okay, said I usually never disappeared without saying something. I told him I had been sick. He replied that he was glad I was still alive. That phrasing stuck with me. A week later, he suggested we do a video call workout together. I said no. I told him I was self-conscious and preferred staying anonymous. He said that was fine. He said he respected boundaries. Then he added that he already had a pretty clear picture of me anyway. I asked what he meant. He said posture, gait, typing rhythm. People leave patterns everywhere. I laughed it off, made a joke about him being creepy. He responded with a laughing emoji and said occupational hazard. I asked what his occupation was. He did not answer. A few days later, I noticed something strange. My phone battery had started draining faster than usual. I chalked it up to age or background apps. Then my phone began warming up at night while it sat untouched on my nightstand. One evening, while scrolling through photos, I noticed something I did not remember taking. It was a picture of my living room. Not a screenshot, not a reflection, a photo taken from the hallway. The timestamp said it was taken at 1:43 a.m. 3 nights earlier. I stared at it until my chest started to hurt. I texted Mark immediately asking if this was some kind of joke, asking if the group had been hacked, asking anything that would make this not real. He replied within seconds. He said, "Calm down." He said, "You are safe." He said, "This is why I never needed your address." I ran outside barefoot and called the police. They came. They searched the townhouse. Doors locked, windows intact, no signs of forced entry. They asked if I had carbon monoxide detectors. They asked if I had been under stress. They asked if I took sleep medication. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I checked the app. Mark's account was gone. Not deleted. Gone like it had never existed. I unplugged my router, powered off my phone, sat on my couch in silence, trying to convince myself this was some elaborate misunderstanding. Then I heard my phone vibrate. It was still off. A notification appeared on the dark screen. Unknown sender. It said, "You should not have involved them." That was the moment I understood something important. This was never about friendship. It was about access. And I had already given him everything he needed. I stayed in my car until the sun came up, watching my front door like it might open on its own. Every shadow felt deliberate. Every passing headlight made my pulse jump. My phone stayed off in the cup holder beside me. But every few minutes, I felt a phantom vibration in my leg. The kind your body invents when it is expecting something bad. When daylight finally hit the front of the townhouse, I drove straight to my sister's place in Columbus without packing a single thing. I told myself I would come back later with police. But even saying that felt like a lie. I was telling myself to stay calm. I told my sister everything once I got inside. Not emotionally, not dramatically. I laid it out the way you would explain a technical problem at work, step by step, because I was terrified that if I sounded scared, she would think I was unstable. She listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she locked the doors and pulled the curtains without saying a word. That was when I knew she believed me. We wiped my phone completely and bought a cheap replacement with a new number. That afternoon, I changed passwords to everything I could think of and shut down accounts I had used for years. That night, I slept on her couch with the lights on. And even then, I woke up every hour expecting to hear my name spoken from somewhere in the house. For 2 days, nothing happened. No messages, no strange photos, no signs that I was being watched. By the 3rd day, shame started creeping in. I wondered if stress and loneliness had finally broken something in my head. I started rehearsing how I would explain this later as an overreaction. That illusion shattered just after midnight when my sister's internet went out without warning. At the exact same moment, my new phone buzzed in my hand. Unknown sender again. The message said, "You switched devices too late." My stomach dropped so fast, I thought I might throw up. I called the police immediately. This time, they took the report more seriously, but I could still feel the unspoken doubt behind their questions. They asked about cyberstalking, data breaches, whether I had installed any unknown apps. They asked if I had enemies. One officer told me that most cases like this turned out to be pranks or misunderstandings, but the ones that were not usually involved someone who wanted control, not attention. He said those were the hardest to stop. That sentence lodged itself in my chest and never left. The next morning, my sister opened the front door and froze. There was a manila envelope taped to the outside of the door, placed neatly at eye level. Inside were printed screenshots of my fitness logs, music, my weigh-ins, my meal photos, all annotated in pen, corrections, observations, comments about my posture and pacing. At the bottom of the stack was a floor plan of my townhouse drawn with disturbing precision. Every room labeled, measurements exact, the bedroom circled in red. Under it, written in clean handwriting, were the words "optimal access point confirmed." We did not wait. We packed what we could carry and left. That day, I quit my job remotely. I stopped using apps. I stopped posting anything in real time. I rotated between places like someone hiding from a storm that followed them indoors. Months passed without another message. Slowly, people started telling me I needed to live again, that I could not stay invisible forever. I nodded and pretended I agreed because arguing took energy I did not have. A year later, I moved again. New city, new lease, new routine built deliberately to look boring. I waited months before joining a gym and never logged my workouts anywhere. I spoke to people politely but briefly. I never shared patterns. I never shared habits. I thought I had learned how to disappear correctly. Then one afternoon as I was leaving the gym, a man held the door open for me. He smiled and said, "Good work today. You are moving cleaner now." I stopped mid-step. Music, I did not recognize him. Different face, different voice, different build, but the cadence was identical. Calm, certain, familiar. He leaned closer and said, "You finally fixed your hip flexors. I knew you would." I did not respond. I dropped my bag and walked straight out of the building without looking back. I never reported it. I understood then that reacting was part of what he wanted. I live quietly now. I do not accept encouragement from strangers. I do not let people track me in the name of motivation. I do not believe anyone who says they just want to help. Because the most disturbing truth I learned is not that someone can watch you without you knowing. It is that some people do not want to hurt you at all. They want to optimize you. And once they decide you belong to them, music, the story does not end. It just closes around you. I did not invite him into my home because I trusted him. I invited him because I did not want to be the kind of person who said no when someone needed help. That distinction matters more than people realize. Trust implies belief. This was obligation. An obligation is much easier to exploit. His name was Daniel. We worked in the same municipal records office in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Not close friends, not strangers, just familiar enough. We shared the elevator most mornings. Music, occasionally ate lunch at the same table when the break room was crowded. He knew my name. I knew his. That was the extent of it. He was quiet, almost forgettable, the kind of person you could sit next to for years without learning anything real about. The afternoon he mentioned needing a place to stay. It did not sound urgent. That is what lowered my guard. Music, we were walking out together when he said his landlord had shut off water unexpectedly due to a plumbing issue and told him the unit would be unlivable overnight. He said it casually like it was inconvenient, but music, temporary. He did not ask me for anything. He just said he would probably sleep in his car if he could not find a hotel. I laughed and said that sounded miserable. There was a pause after that. Not awkward, just open. I offered him my couch before I had time to consider what that meant. I even added the phrase just for one night, like saying it out loud would create a boundary strong enough to hold. He hesitated, asked if I was sure, said he did not want to impose. When I insisted, he thanked me once calmly and said he would be gone early. That night, he arrived with a single duffel bag. I remember noticing how light it was, how easily he carried it. He did not bring toiletries, did not bring extra shoes, music, did not bring anything that suggested he expected to stay longer than promised. That detail mattered to me at the time. It made me feel safe. He followed every unspoken rule. Shoes off, bag tucked out of the way, asked before showering, asked before eating. Spoke quietly, slept on the far edge of the couch with the blanket folded neatly in the morning. When I woke up, he was already gone. I felt good about helping him. That feeling did not last. When I came home the next evening, he was there again. Same calm expression, same quiet tone. He explained that the repair timeline had changed. He said the landlord underestimated the damage. He apologized for not messaging first and said if it was an issue, he would leave immediately. This was the moment that defined everything that came after. I said it was fine. What I did not say was that it was not fine anymore. That I felt a subtle pressure in my chest when I unlocked my door. That I had already started rehearsing how to ask him to leave and could not find words that did not make me sound cruel. One night became 2, then 3. Daniel never settled in loudly. He did not sprawl. He did not claim space. He occupied it carefully like someone testing ice with each step. A toothbrush appeared in the bathroom cup. A phone charger near the outlet. A jacket hung over the back of the chair instead of the couch. Each item placed with restraint, as if he knew excess would trigger resistance. I noticed I stopped moving things back after he adjusted them. Not because I agreed with the changes, but because correcting them felt confrontational. It felt like acknowledging that this was no longer temporary. He began waking, music, up before me and leaving later. I would hear him moving around while I was still in bed. The sound of cabinets opening and closing softly, water running, the television volume lowering before I even asked. He was considerate in a way that made me feel unreasonable for being uncomfortable. The first time he referred to the apartment as our place, I laughed like it was a joke. He did not laugh back. He simply continued talking as if that phrasing had already been decided. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself this was just what generosity looked like in adulthood. That discomfort was the price of being decent. Then I started noticing the way he watched me, not staring, observing. He would comment on things I had not mentioned out loud. Ask if work had been rough on days I came home quieter than usual. Ask if I was sleeping well when I felt exhausted. He framed it as concern. I framed it as intuition. I stopped inviting friends over, not because he asked me to, because explaining his presence felt complicated. I stopped taking phone calls in the living room, stopped watching TV late, stopped leaving my bedroom door open at night. I realized one evening that I was adjusting my life around someone who had never asked me to. When I finally brought up his apartment again, he sighed softly like someone tired of repeating themselves. He said the situation was still unresolved. He said these things took time. He said landlords were unpredictable. He did not give dates. He did not give specifics. He spoke in generalities that sounded reasonable enough to delay action. Weeks passed. I found mail addressed to him in my mailbox. Not forwarded, not marked temporary, just his name and my address. When I confronted him about it, he did not deny it. He said he needed an address for paperwork. He said it was easier than constantly explaining himself. He said it did not mean anything. The way he said it made me realize something chilling. He was not asking for permission. He was explaining why permission was unnecessary. That was the moment I understood that Daniel was not waiting for a solution. He was waiting for me to stop resisting quietly enough that he would not need one. The shift did not happen overnight. That is what makes it difficult to explain to anyone who has not lived through something like this. There was no argument, no confrontation, no moment where I could clearly say this is when he crossed the line. Instead, the apartment slowly stopped responding to me the way it used to. I would reach for things and find them gone or relocated. Not hidden, just moved to where Daniel thought they made more sense. When I asked, he always had a reason. He spoke calmly, thoughtfully, like someone explaining a minor improvement I had simply not considered. I started realizing that decisions were being made without me. The thermostat was adjusted before I touched it. The trash was taken out on a different schedule. Groceries appeared that I did not buy, but somehow felt obligated to eat because he had paid for them. When I pushed back gently, he apologized immediately, then repeated the behavior days later in a slightly different way. Each time, it became harder to justify bringing it up again without sounding obsessive. At some point, my name stopped feeling anchored to the apartment. Packages arrived addressed to him. Maintenance requests were submitted under his email. I found a printed copy of the lease agreement on the table one morning with a highlighted section about authorized occupants. Daniel noticed me looking at it and said he had just been reviewing tenant responsibilities so he would not accidentally violate anything. The way he said it implied that he already belonged there and was simply making sure he was doing it correctly. I began sleeping with my bedroom door locked, not because I thought he would come in, but because locking it reminded me that part of the apartment was still mine. Music, that illusion did not last. One evening, I came home to find the lock replaced. Daniel explained that the old one had been loose and he did not want me feeling unsafe. He handed me a new key and smiled like he had done me a favor. I thanked him automatically, and the sound of my own voice doing that made my stomach turn. When I finally tried to set a boundary clearly, it felt like pushing against fog. I told him I needed a timeline. I told him I needed certainty. He listened without interrupting, nodded, and said he understood. Then he said something that still replays in my head. He said, transitions are easier when you stop framing them as exits. He said this arrangement had stabilized both of us and destabilizing it again could be harmful. He said forcing change before it was ready often caused more damage than patience. The language sounded reasonable, professional, like advice you would hear from someone trained in mediation. I.e. music, realized then that he was not avoiding the conversation. He was absorbing it and redirecting it until I felt foolish for starting it. The night everything closed around me, I came home later than usual and found my key no longer worked. I assumed the lock was jammed until Daniel opened the door from inside. He looked surprised to see me standing there confused. He said maintenance had been through earlier and replaced the lock because of a reported security issue. He said he had handled it since he was home. He said management would update me soon. They did. The next morning, the property office confirmed that Daniel was now listed as an occupant with full access privileges. They said the authorization had been submitted weeks earlier with my digital signature. When I told them I did not remember signing anything like that, they reminded me how many documents people clicked through without reading. They were not wrong. I did not fight him. I did not scream. I packed what I could carry and left quietly because somewhere along the way I had learned that resistance only taught him how to tighten the situation without raising alarms. When I told him I was moving out, music, he nodded and said he hoped I found a place that felt more aligned with my needs. He said it without irony. I live alone now in a studio apartment I never personalize. Nothing on the walls, nothing that suggests permanence. I do not let people stay over. I do not offer help that would require explanation. When someone tells me a story about needing just one night, I feel my chest tighten in a way I cannot explain to them. Because the most terrifying part was not that he took my apartment. It was that he never had to force anything. He waited for me to surrender it piece by piece, convinced the entire time that I was the one choosing to be reasonable. I met him in a place where everyone assumes they are safe by default. That assumption is what made this possible. We were both enrolled in a night class at a community college outside Raleigh, North Carolina. The kind of continuing education program meant for adults who already had lives and routines and did not expect anything dramatic to happen between work and home. It was a data analytics course, dry on the surface, but full of people who paid attention to details for a living. We sat near each other for weeks without speaking, exchanging music, only the polite nod people give when they recognize a familiar face, but have no reason to engage in music further. One night, the instructor made a joke about how half the room looked like they regretted signing up, and he laughed out loud. Not politely, not to be social, just a genuine reaction. I laughed too, and for a brief moment, it felt like an unspoken connection formed, the kind that feels harmless and human. After class, he commented on it casually, said it was refreshing to hear someone still react honestly after a long workday. His tone was relaxed, measured, not invasive. We talked for less than 2 minutes before going our separate ways, and nothing about it felt significant at the time. Over the next few weeks, we started talking more, not about personal things, about coursework, software tools, the difficulty of focusing late at night. He remembered small details I mentioned in passing, like the kind of work I did and which nights I struggled to stay alert. I remember thinking he was just observant. Some people are like that. They listen instead of waiting for their turn to talk. Eventually, we started getting coffee before class. Always the same place, always the same table near the window, always early. He positioned himself so he could see the door without turning his head. At the time, it felt like preference. Music, later, I realized it was habit. He talked carefully about himself. Said he had worked in research before, but never elaborated. When I asked what kind, he said behavioral analytics and moved on smoothly, not evasive, just complete. The answer felt finished in a way that discouraged follow-ups. The first time something felt off. It was small enough to dismiss. After class one night, we walked to the parking lot together. A light flickered overhead. My car alarm chirped louder than usual when I unlocked it. My heart jumped, then settled. He commented on it without looking at me. Said sudden noises triggered alertness even when there was no threat. He said it like a fact, not a warning. I shrugged it off. After that, similar things kept happening. Minor disruptions spaced just far enough apart that I could not connect them easily. Elevators pausing longer than expected. Doors sticking before opening. My phone vibrating with no notification. Each time he was nearby, each time he watched my reaction without making it obvious, he would say things like that got your attention, or most people would not even register that. I told myself he was curious about behavior in an abstract way, that he saw the world through data. One evening, he asked if I believed fear was random. I said probably. He shook his head and said fear followed patterns if you observed long enough. He said unpredictability was mostly an illusion people clung to because it made them feel free. The way he said it made my stomach tighten slightly, but there was nothing concrete to react to. That night, I came home and found my front door unlocked. Nothing was disturbed, nothing missing. I told myself I had forgotten. Still, I slept lightly, waking at every sound. The next morning, before I mentioned anything, he asked if I had slept poorly. I asked how he knew. He said, most people do after a spike in stress. The word spike stayed with me. From then on, I started noticing how often he anticipated things before I voiced them. He would comment on my mood before I understood it myself. Ask about headaches I had not mentioned, suggest breaks on nights when my focus slipped. It felt like concern. It sounded like insight, but it began to feel like prediction. The incidents escalated slowly. Never dangerous, never illegal, just enough to trigger responses. A fire alarm test announced without warning. A stranger knocking on my door asking for the wrong unit late at night. My power flickering off for a few seconds during a storm. Each time I reacted. Each time he asked afterward how it felt, not emotionally, physiologically, heart rate, breathing, focus. I asked him once if he was messing with me. He smiled and said no, then added that most people underestimated how much their environment shaped them. He said that was why ethical research mattered. That word lodged itself in my chest. One evening after class, he admitted something casually, like he was sharing trivia. He said he had been removed from a formal research program years earlier for methodological disagreements. He said institutions feared uncomfortable data. He said progress often required observation outside music-controlled environments. I laughed nervously and asked if that was supposed to make me feel better. He said it should. He said consent ruined authenticity. That night, I sat in my car for a long time before going inside. For the first time, I wondered how many of the moments I had dismissed were intentional. How many reactions had been noted, how much of my fear had been measured quietly while I believed I was just living my life. I did not know then that part one of his work was already complete, and that I was about to learn what he did when the data stopped being theoretical. Once the thought settled in my mind that I was being observed deliberately, I stopped experiencing fear the way I used to. Instead of sharp spikes, it became a constant background pressure, like a low electrical hum that never fully shut off. I started noticing how carefully my days were arranged, how predictable my movements had become without me ever choosing them consciously. It was uncomfortable realizing how easy it had been for someone else to learn me simply by standing close enough for long enough. I began replaying moments I had dismissed before. The way he always seemed to know when something had unsettled me, the timing of his questions, the calmness in his voice when mine wasn't. It felt less like concern now and more like confirmation. As if my reactions were answering questions I had never been asked. I stopped reacting naturally. When something startled me, I forced my breathing steady. When my pulse jumped, I kept my face neutral. I answered his questions with vagueness instead of detail. If I was part of an experiment, I wanted to see what happened when the variables stopped behaving. That was when the disruptions intensified. They did not become dramatic or violent. They became precise. A locked stairwell that usually stayed open. A campus alert test that arrived minutes after I finally relaxed. A stranger asking me for directions late at night when the area was normally empty. None of it crossed a line that could be reported on its own, but together they felt arranged, like someone testing thresholds. After each one, he appeared, asking how I felt, whether I noticed the difference between surprise and expectation. He spoke less like a friend and more like someone tracking progress. I started writing everything down, not emotionally, methodically. Dates, times, locations, his presence before and after, his phrasing. Patterns became impossible to ignore once they were laid out in ink. The incidents aligned with my schedule, not his. They clustered around moments when I seemed relaxed. They slowed when I became guarded. That was when fear turned into clarity. This was not curiosity anymore. It was design. I contacted the college under the guise of asking about ethics policies tied to continuing education programs. The response was polite but careful. When I mentioned his name, the conversation shifted. I was asked questions instead of given answers. Days later, an administrator called me directly and asked how often we interacted outside of class. The tone was measured, but there was weight behind it. Like this was not the first time his name had surfaced in an uncomfortable context. I learned more than I wanted to know. Years earlier, he had been removed from a formal research program for conducting unsanctioned exposure tests on peers. Not illegal, not criminal, just unethical enough to be stopped quietly. He had argued that informed consent contaminated fear data. That people behaved differently when they knew they were being observed. He had not accepted that answer. He had simply taken his work elsewhere. Knowing that changed everything, I did not confront him. I did not accuse him. I did something far less dramatic and far more effective. I listened. I asked questions. I mirrored his language. I let him talk about his theories. About how environments shape people. About how fear could be mapped without harm if you were careful enough. He spoke with confidence, with the kind of certainty that comes from believing your work justifies itself. I recorded every conversation. When I finally handed everything over, it did not result in a scene. There were no raised voices or public confrontations. He stopped attending class. Then his access badge stopped working. Then his email disappeared from the student directory. The college handled it quietly, the way institutions always do when they want something to end without drawing attention to how long it went unnoticed. The last time I saw him was outside the building one evening. He looked smaller somehow, like the environment no longer belonged to him. He did not apologize. He said I had interfered with something important. I told him people are not environments. He did not argue. He just nodded like he had reached the end of a study and did not like the results. Life did not snap back to normal after that. Fear does not evaporate just because the source is gone. It fades gradually, loosening its grip one day at a time. I finished the course online. I changed my routine. I moved apartments. I learned to trust my reactions again instead of suppressing them for the sake of politeness or curiosity. The most unsettling part of all this is not that someone tried to scare me. It is that fear when treated as data stops being a warning and starts becoming a tool. And the reason I can live with what happened now is because I learned something before it went further. I learned that paying attention is not paranoia, that discomfort is not weakness, and that the moment something feels like it is being measured instead of shared, you are allowed to step out of the experiment before it decides what you are. The first time he showed concern about me, I thought it was kindness. That is important to say upfront because nothing about what happened later would have worked if it had started any other way. Concern is disarming. It feels responsible. It makes you second-guess your own defensiveness. When someone says they are worried about you, the instinct is not to protect yourself. It is to reassure them. I met him through a volunteer orientation in Fort Collins, Colorado. It was a weekend program for people helping with trail maintenance and wildfire prevention outreach. Nothing intense, just paperwork, safety briefings, and small talk with strangers who wanted to feel useful. His name was Rowan. He spoke carefully, listened more than he talked, and asked questions that made him sound thoughtful instead of curious. We were paired together for a short training exercise and the conversation flowed easily enough that we exchanged numbers afterward. At first, our friendship existed entirely in safe, neutral spaces, coffee shops, group hikes, public events. He never invited himself into my home, never lingered, never crossed what people usually mean when they say boundaries. He asked about my work, my routines, my stress levels. The kind of questions people ask when they want to understand how someone is doing. I answered honestly because nothing about the questions felt invasive. The first time he framed something I said as concerning, it was subtle. I mentioned being tired after a rough week at work and joked that sometimes I wished I could just disappear for a while. He smiled politely but didn't laugh. He asked if I ever had thoughts about hurting myself or others. He asked it calmly like it was something he asked everyone. I said no and laughed it off. He nodded satisfied and the moment passed. After that, I noticed he remembered things I had said more vividly than I did. Comments I had made in passing weeks earlier, jokes, offhand frustrations. He would bring them up later, not to accuse me, but to check in. He would say things like, "You mentioned you get overwhelmed when plans change suddenly." Or, "You said crowds sometimes make you tense." He framed it as empathy. I framed it as attentiveness. Then the language started shifting. Instead of asking how I was feeling, he started asking how I was coping. Instead of saying that sounds stressful, he would say that kind of stress can build over time if it isn't addressed. He began recommending articles, podcasts, assessments, all framed as resources, all optional, all reasonable. I thanked him and told myself he was just someone who took mental health seriously. The first real consequence came without warning. My supervisor at work called me into her office and asked if everything was okay. She said someone had reached out anonymously to express concern about my well-being. They hadn't accused me of anything specific. They just suggested that I might be struggling more than I realized, music, and that it could be affecting team dynamics. My supervisor told me she didn't agree, but company policy required her to check in. I was embarrassed but not alarmed. I told Rowan about it later, half joking. His expression changed in a way I couldn't immediately name. He said he was glad someone was looking out for me. He said, early intervention was always better than waiting for something to go wrong. He said, sometimes people don't see themselves clearly. That sentence stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, small things began closing off around me. An application I had put in for a leadership program was quietly declined without explanation. A landlord I had been in talks with suddenly stopped responding. A longtime friend cancelled plans repeatedly, music, and eventually admitted she had heard I was going through some things and didn't want to overwhelm me. No one said what the things were. They just said they hoped I was getting support. When I finally asked Rowan directly if he had spoken to anyone about me, he didn't deny it. He said he had raised concerns where appropriate. He said he never used my name in ways that could be traced back to me directly. Music, he said he felt a responsibility to act when he noticed patterns. He listed them calmly. My sleep, music, schedule, my stress, my offhand jokes, my frustration with authority, my tendency to isolate when overwhelmed. He said these were not accusations. Music, they were indicators. I told him he was crossing a line. He looked genuinely confused. He said lines existed to protect people, not hide risks. He said if he was wrong, then no harm would come of it. He said if he was right, then doing nothing would have been irresponsible. I stopped responding to his messages after that. I thought distance would solve it. It didn't. What I didn't understand yet was that he no longer needed my participation. He had already reframed my silence as further evidence. Withdrawal, avoidance, escalation. Each step I took to reclaim my privacy became in his narrative another reason someone should be concerned. By the time I realized what he had actually decided about me, the decision had already begun moving through systems that did not need my consent to keep going. And the worst part was this. He truly believed he was doing the right thing. Once Rowan stopped contacting me in music directly, I assumed the situation would cool down. That assumption came from the belief that conflict requires participation. I did not understand yet that he had already moved past needing my involvement. Silence did not pause what he had started. It confirmed it. In his version of events, my withdrawal was not a boundary. It was deterioration. The first official consequence arrived in the form of a meeting request from Human Resources. No accusation, no complaint, just a wellness check. They told me someone had expressed concern about my mental state and how it might impact workplace safety. They emphasized that this was preventative, not disciplinary. They said that phrase more than once, preventative, like reassurance, like it wasn't already too late. They asked about my stress levels, my sleep, whether I had ever felt overwhelmed to the point of losing control. The questions were framed carefully, the way questions are when the answers are already being interpreted before you finish speaking. I answered honestly. I denied anything extreme. I left feeling shaken, but still convinced that transparency, music, would protect me. It didn't. Over the next month, things I had been working toward quietly dissolved. A promotion I was shortlisted for disappeared without explanation. A project I led was reassigned temporarily. Co-workers stopped confiding in me. Conversations shifted when I entered rooms. No one accused me of anything outright. They just looked, music, at me differently, like they were measuring how close I was to becoming a problem. When I tried to defend myself, it backfired. The more I explained, the more concerned people became. The more calm I sounded, the more it seemed rehearsed. I started noticing how my words landed before I finished saying them, how every attempt at clarity sounded like justification. It felt like speaking into a system that had already decided what I meant. I finally confronted Rowan in person at a public trailhead where we used to meet for volunteer work. I told him he was destroying my life. I told him he had no right to involve himself the way he did. He listened without interrupting, hands folded, expression neutral. When I finished, he said he was sorry I felt that way. He said discomfort was a common response when people were confronted with truths they weren't ready to accept. He said everything he had done was documented and responsible. He said he never made claims. He only raised concerns. That distinction mattered to him. He told me something then that still makes my skin crawl. He said systems don't need certainty. They only need probability. He said risk management wasn't about being right. It was about being cautious in the face of unknowns. He said if he was wrong, nothing permanent would happen. He said if he was right and no one acted, the consequences could be severe. I asked him what he thought I was capable of. He didn't answer. That was when I understood the true shape of what he had done. He had not accused me of being dangerous. He had positioned me as someone who might be, someone whose future actions needed monitoring, someone whose access needed limitation, someone whose opportunities needed review. In that space between accusation and innocence, anything could be justified. Landlord stopped responding to my inquiries. When I finally got one on the phone, she hesitated before saying she had received a reference warning advising additional screening. A friend I had known for over a decade stopped returning my calls. Months later, she admitted she had been told I was struggling in ways that made it hard to know what version of me she would get. She said she didn't want to risk saying the wrong thing. I lost my job quietly. Officially, it was restructuring. Unofficially, I was offered a severance package contingent on agreeing to a voluntary mental health evaluation and a non-disclosure clause. I signed it because I needed the money and because fighting would have required proving a negative. I could not prove I was not dangerous. I could only insist it. That insistence had stopped carrying weight. I moved out of Fort Collins after that. Not dramatically, quietly. No announcement, no explanation. I took contract work that required minimal interaction and paid less than half of what I used to make. I stopped volunteering. I stopped making new friends. Every introduction felt like a liability. Every conversation felt like potential data. I sometimes wonder how many files exist with my name attached to phrases like elevated risk or concerning patterns. I wonder how many decisions are still being made with that version of me in mind. I will never know. That is part of the punishment. The last message Rowan ever sent me arrived months after I moved. It said he hoped I was getting the support I needed. It said prevention was an act of care. It said some people never understand the harm they are capable of until someone steps in. I didn't reply. There is no appeal process for being quietly categorized as unsafe. No courtroom, no confrontation, just closed doors and softened voices and opportunities that evaporate without explanation. The world doesn't reject you loudly. It just starts protecting itself from you. And the most disturbing part is not that one person decided I was dangerous. It's that once the idea was introduced, everyone else found it easier to believe him than to risk being wrong about me. My manager didn't accuse me of anything. She didn't even sound concerned. She just asked a question that made my stomach drop because it was clear it wasn't really a question at all. She said, "I just want to make sure we're aligned on how you've been coming across lately." The way she said it made it obvious that a version of me already existed in her head and I hadn't been involved in creating it. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, then smiled politely and said nothing specific, just that a few people had expressed concern, not complaints. Concern. She emphasized that word twice like it was meant to soften the impact. She told me she didn't personally see an issue, but it was important to check in before things became misunderstandings. I nodded, thanked her, and walked back to my desk, feeling like I had just stepped out of a conversation that had started long before I entered the room. That was the moment I realized something had been happening around me without my awareness. I met Miles 6 months earlier when he joined our team at a marketing firm in Madison, Wisconsin. He was hired quietly, slid into the workflow without disruption, and became someone people naturally grouped with. He wasn't charismatic or awkward. Music, he didn't dominate conversations or fade into the background. He occupied space in a way that felt neutral, which in an office environment often reads as trustworthy. We started getting lunch together simply because our schedules lined up. It felt normal, safe. Miles never overshared. He listened more than he talked. When I vented about deadlines or joked about being burned out, he didn't escalate it or dismiss it. He just nodded, sometimes asking a follow-up question that felt thoughtful rather than probing. At the time, I thought he was just emotionally intelligent. The kind of coworker people like having around because they don't add noise. Looking back, I can see how careful he was. The first time I noticed something was off was after a team meeting where I made a joke about how a delayed project might sink us all. It landed the way those jokes always, music, do. A few laughs, a few groans, nothing memorable, but afterward a coworker stopped me in the hallway, music, and asked if everything was okay. I assumed she meant work stress and laughed it off. She smiled, but her expression didn't fully relax. Over the next few weeks, interactions like that multiplied. A client asked to have another team member included on emails just in case. A colleague suggested I take a mental health day even though I hadn't said I needed one. Conversation softened around me like people were worried about saying the wrong thing. No one said I had done anything, music, wrong. They just behaved like I might. Miles was present for most of these moments. Not instigating them, not amplifying them, just there. When someone misinterpreted something I said, he didn't jump in to clarify. When a joke was taken too seriously, music, he didn't correct the tone. He stayed quiet, his face neutral, letting the moment pass. In group settings, silence carries weight. I didn't understand that yet. Music, the first time his silence followed me outside the office was during a casual happy hour. I mentioned feeling stretched thin, something everyone there could relate to. One person asked if I was managing okay. Another said I'd seemed quieter lately. Miles took a sip of his drink and said nothing. When someone asked him directly if he'd noticed anything, he shrugged and said, "I think everyone's under a lot of pressure right now." It sounded reasonable. It sounded supportive, but it wasn't a correction. Later that night, music, a coworker texted me asking if I was all right. She said she'd heard I was having a rough time and wanted to check in. When I asked who told her that, she hesitated before, saying she didn't want to make things awkward. She said Miles had mentioned I'd been dealing with a lot. He hadn't said that to me. And according to her, he hadn't exactly said it to her either. He'd just allowed the idea to form. When I asked Miles about it the next day, he looked genuinely, music, puzzled. He said he hadn't said anything inaccurate. He said people notice patterns on their own. He said it was good that coworkers cared enough to check in. His tone was calm, reassuring, almost parental. I left the conversation feeling embarrassed for questioning him at all. After that, I started noticing how often misunderstandings happened when he was nearby. How frequently he positioned himself just close enough to hear, just far enough not to be involved. He never, music, lied. He never exaggerated. He never added details. He simply didn't correct what others assumed. And in an office environment, assumptions don't need encouragement. They only need space. I began trying to correct people myself, but it made things worse. The more I clarified, the more people softened their voices. The more I insisted I was fine, the more it sounded like I was convincing myself. Miles watched these exchanges quietly, never stepping in, never saying, "That's not what he meant," never anchoring the narrative to reality. By the time my manager asked that first question, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't about rumors. It wasn't about gossip. It was about silence being mistaken for agreement. An agreement slowly becoming consensus. And Miles had been sitting beside me the entire time, letting that consensus form without ever saying a word. After that meeting with my manager, I started noticing how often I was being assessed without being told I was under assessment. Conversations took on a careful quality, like everyone was choosing words with tweezers. People asked how I was doing in tones usually reserved for someone recovering from something. No one would tell me what that something was. They just kept checking music, din. And every check-in made it clearer that whatever version of me they were responding to had already solidified. I tried to trace it back. Clear's throat, I replayed meetings, emails, casual comments, looking for a moment I could point to and say, that was it. There wasn't one. There was only accumulation. Small impressions layered on top of each other until they stopped feeling small. I realized how often Miles had been present for those moments. Not steering them, not amplifying them, just close enough that his lack of reaction carried weight. When someone looked to him for confirmation, he didn't nod, but he didn't shake his head either. He stayed neutral, which in practice meant letting the interpretation stand. I tested it once. During a team discussion, I made a deliberately exaggerated joke about being overwhelmed, then immediately followed it with a clear clarification that I was kidding. The room relaxed. A few people laughed. Then someone glanced at Miles. He didn't smile. He didn't react at all. The energy shifted back. The joke lost its footing. The clarification didn't stick. Later that day, someone messaged me asking if I needed help managing my workload. That was when it hit me that I wasn't losing control of my narrative in bursts. I was losing it by inches. I confronted Miles again, more directly this time. I told him his silence was creating problems for me. He listened carefully, hands folded, expression thoughtful. When I finished, he said he didn't feel comfortable correcting other people's interpretations. He said everyone was entitled to their perspective. He said stepping in might feel dismissive of their concerns. He said it was better to let people arrive at their own conclusions. I asked him what he thought those conclusions were. He paused, then said he thought people were just being cautious. He said caution wasn't a bad thing. After that, things accelerated. I was removed from a client-facing role temporarily. A project I had pitched was reassigned so I could focus on stability. No one used words like risk or danger. They didn't need to. The adjustments spoke for themselves. My responsibilities narrowed. My access shrank. My presence felt conditional. Outside of work, it followed me. A friend cancelled plans and said she'd heard I was dealing with some stuff and didn't want to push me. Another asked if I was seeing someone professionally and reassured me there was no shame in it. When I pressed for details, they both said the same thing. They couldn't really explain it. Music, they just had a feeling. I stopped sharing anything personal. That didn't help. Silence became further proof that I was withdrawing. When I stayed upbeat, it felt forced. When I was quiet, it felt ominous. There was no version of myself that landed cleanly anymore. I asked my manager directly if anyone had accused me of something. She said no. I asked if anyone had named a specific concern. She said not exactly. She said it was more about tone and patterns. I asked whose tone, whose patterns? She said it didn't matter. She said the goal was to make sure everyone felt safe and supported. Safe from what was the question no one would answer. Miles stopped joining me for lunch around that time. Not abruptly, gradually. He was still music, friendly, still polite, still present in meetings. But he no longer positioned himself beside me. He didn't need to. The work had already been done. The assumptions didn't require maintenance. They had taken on a life of their own. The last time I spoke to him privately, I asked him why he never corrected anyone. He didn't deny that he could have. He said he didn't think it was his role. He said sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is let people protect themselves. He said he would rather be wrong and cautious than right and regretful. I asked him what exactly he thought people were protecting themselves from. He didn't, answer. He just looked at me for a long moment, then said he hoped I understood it wasn't personal. Not long after that, I was offered a severance package framed as a mutual decision. No accusations, no documentation of wrongdoing, just a quiet exit. I took e-music it because fighting would have meant demanding clarity from a system that had learned to function without it. I moved cities. I stopped adding coworkers on social media. I became careful about how much of myself I let anyone see. Every new group felt like a fresh surface that could crack if someone stayed silent in the wrong moment. Sometimes I wonder where Miles is now. Whether he still sits quietly in conversations, letting others fill in gaps with their own fears. Whether there are other people walking around under a version of themselves they didn't create, shaped not by lies, but by what no one bothered to correct. I don't know if the silence ever stops spreading once it starts. And that's the part that still keeps me awake. The first sign that something was wrong was a message I never received. I only learned about it later after everything else had already happened when I was trying to reconstruct the timeline like you do after a near miss. At the time, all I knew was that my phone felt quieter than usual that afternoon. No notifications, no random spam, just a long empty stretch of silence that I didn't think twice about because silence usually means nothing. I met him at a co-working space in Spokane, Washington, a place I started using after my company went fully remote. He sat 2 tables over most mornings, always facing the wall instead of the e-music room. Headphones on, back straight, posture alert. We didn't talk at first. We just existed in the same space long enough that familiarity settled in naturally. One day, the internet went down and we ended up standing outside together, waiting for it to come back. He made a dry comment about how much productivity depended on invisible systems working quietly. I agreed, and that was it. A conversation that ended where it should have. Over the next few weeks, we talked more. Nothing personal, work, news, local stuff. He had a way of steering conversations away from details without making it obvious. If I mentioned where I lived, he'd redirect to the neighborhood in general. If I talked about my routine, he'd ask about preferences instead of specifics. At the time, it felt like respect, like he wasn't trying to pry. The first time he interfered with my plans, I didn't see it as interference. I had mentioned grabbing a drink with someone I'd recently met through an app. He paused for half a second longer than usual and asked where the place was. When I told him, he said he'd heard it had issues with late-night crowd control and suggested a different bar across town. He framed it casually, like a tip. I took it. Why wouldn't I? Small redirections like that became normal. He'd suggest leaving earlier than planned because traffic patterns were unpredictable at night. He'd recommend walking on the opposite side of the street because of construction that never seemed to be there when I checked. He once asked me to text him when I got home after an event, then brushed it off his habit from an old roommate situation. Each thing on its own was harmless. Collectively, it started to feel like I was being managed. What unsettled me wasn't that he seemed concerned. It was how confident he was about things he couldn't reasonably know. He never said, "I'm worried." He said, "This is safer." Or, "That's better." Like he was adjusting variables in an equation only he could see. When I pushed back lightly, he didn't argue. He just said it was my call and went quiet, which somehow made me reconsider every time. The first time I felt actual fear was the night he showed up somewhere I hadn't told him I was going. It was a trivia night at a brewery I went to on a whim after work. I was halfway through the second round when I saw him near the bar, not looking for me, just scanning the room briefly before sitting down. When I asked how he knew I'd be there, he said he didn't. He said he just had a feeling it was a good night to get out of the house. The answer didn't make sense, but it wasn't incriminating either. After that, I started noticing gaps in my memory that weren't really gaps, just absences. Calls I thought I'd returned but hadn't. Messages I assumed I'd received that never arrived. My phone never showed missed notifications, but people would ask if I'd seen something they'd sent. When I mentioned it to him, he suggested updating my operating system and changing my settings. He offered to help, then stopped himself and said it was probably better if I handled my own devices. That sentence stayed with me. The tension between us peaked the night I told him I needed space. I said it carefully, trying not to accuse him of anything specific because I couldn't. I just said the dynamic felt intense and I wanted to reset it. He listened without interrupting, then nodded and said he understood. He said he'd been waiting for me to say that. He said some things were getting close to a point where timing mattered. I asked him what that meant. He looked at me for a long moment, then said he couldn't explain without making things worse. He said I'd be safer not knowing yet. That was the first time he'd ever said something that sounded like a warning instead of a suggestion. I told him that wasn't acceptable and walked away before he could respond. That night, I went home and locked my door, feeling foolish for being rattled by someone who hadn't technically done anything wrong. I checked my phone out of habit and noticed a voicemail I didn't recognize. It was short, static heavy, a voice I didn't know asking if I was still coming and saying they'd been waiting longer than expected. No name, no context, just the sound of impatience creeping into the last few seconds before it cut off. I deleted it, assuming it was a wrong number. I didn't sleep much after that. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone buzzed with a single text from him. It just said, "Do not leave your apartment tomorrow until I tell you it's okay." No explanation, no follow-up. I stared at it for a long time, my heart thumping, trying to decide whether this was the moment he crossed from unsettling into dangerous. I typed out a response, then deleted it. I didn't reply at all. When morning came, there were 3 missed calls from an unknown number and an email from my building management asking if I had reported someone trying to access my unit overnight. They said a man had claimed he was a friend who needed to retrieve something I'd forgotten. He'd left before security arrived. I sat on my bed, phone in my hand, replaying every redirected plan, every delayed exit, every moment he'd subtly kept me somewhere else. For the first time, the idea formed clearly and fully, not as paranoia, but as a possibility I couldn't ignore anymore. Whatever he'd been protecting me from hadn't been hypothetical. And whatever it wasn't finished yet. I did not respond to his message. That choice felt important in the moment, like the last piece of control I still had. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to slow my breathing while my phone stayed face down beside me. Vibrating every few minutes with notifications I was too afraid to check. I told myself that if I stayed inside, if I did nothing, then nothing could escalate. That was the logic I clung to, even as the sense of being watched settled, music, deeper into my chest. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at my door. Not loud, not urgent, just firm enough to make it clear someone expected an answer. I froze, listening. After a few seconds, the knock came again, followed by a voice I didn't recognize asking my name. He said it casually like we'd spoken before. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I waited until footsteps retreated down the hallway and the building returned to its usual quiet hum. That was when my phone rang. It was him. I answered, music, without thinking, the sound of my own voice surprising me. He didn't greet, music, me. He didn't ask how I was. He asked if I was still inside. When I said yes, he exhaled slowly, music, like he'd been holding his breath for a while. He told me to stay there for the rest of the day. He told me not to open the door for anyone, not even management, unless he confirmed it first. I told him he couldn't seriously expect me to follow instructions like that. He said he wasn't asking me to trust him. He said he was asking me to survive a timing problem. I demanded, music, an explanation. He paused, then said there was someone who believed we knew each other better than we did. He said this person had been tracking my routine loosely, not precisely enough to act yet, but enough to notice patterns. He said a few of my recent changes had disrupted those patterns in a way that made the situation unstable. He said that was why he'd been nudging me quietly to safer alternatives. He said the voicemail I deleted wasn't a mistake. I asked how he knew all this. He told me he'd crossed paths with this person months earlier through a mutual acquaintance and recognized signs he'd learned to take seriously. He said he'd tried to report it once and been told there wasn't enough to act on. He said, sometimes the only thing you can do is reduce someone's access until interest fades. He said, I was never supposed to know because fear makes people predictable and predictability makes things worse. I wanted to believe, music, him. I also wanted to hang up. The afternoon dragged on in slow, disjointed pieces. Music, every sound in the hallway made my muscles tense. Every car door outside felt too, music, close. He checked in twice, each time brief, each time focused on whether anything had changed. Music, late in the day, he told me it was safe to leave, but only if I went somewhere public and stayed there until evening. He gave me a list of places that would be busy enough to blend into. I didn't ask how he knew which ones were busiest on a music weekday. That night, police cars sat outside my building longer than usual. No sirens, no lights, just presence. The next morning, there was an email from management saying an individual had been formally trespassed from the property after attempting to access multiple units using different explanations. They thanked residents for their patience and said no further action was required. I never saw the man. I never learned his name. I don't know how close he actually got or how long he'd been watching before things shifted. I only know that when it was over, my routines no longer felt like habits. They felt like vulnerabilities. I met him one last time at the co-working space a week later. He looked exhausted, older somehow. I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner. He said because once you know something like that, you can't unknow it, and the way you move through the world changes permanently. Music, he said he'd hoped to keep me just ignorant enough to stay unpredictable. I asked him why he'd taken that responsibility on himself. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, sometimes you protect someone, not because you're brave, but because you're the only one who notices the danger early enough to matter. We didn't keep in touch after that. I changed spaces, changed routines, changed the way I let people know me. The happy ending, if you can call it that, is music, simple. I'm still here. Nothing happened. That's it. But every now and then when my phone is quiet for too long, I think about the message I never received, the plans that were quietly redirected, the places I didn't go, and I wonder how close something worse came to becoming real without ever needing to announce itself at all. I was already inside the restaurant when I realized I hadn't chosen it. That sounds strange, but that's exactly how it felt. I was standing near the counter, menu board glowing above me, wallet in my hand, and there was a brief moment where my brain tried to retrace the decision and couldn't. I remembered leaving work. I remembered driving. I remembered turning off my usual street. What I didn't remember was deciding to be there. That was when I noticed him. He was seated at the counter, finished plate pushed slightly aside, scrolling through his phone like someone killing time after eating, not watching me, not angled toward the door, just present in a way that suggested he'd arrived before I had and expected to stay longer. When our eyes met, he gave a polite half smile, the kind you give strangers when you accidentally make eye contact. Nothing threatening, nothing memorable. I ordered, ate, left, and didn't think about him again until days later when the same feeling returned in a completely different place. This time, it was a coffee shop I hadn't planned on visiting. I'd woken up late, skipped my usual stop, and followed traffic into a part of Columbus I rarely drove through. The decision was impulsive enough that I didn't even check my phone. I parked, walked in, and stood in line behind 3 people. As the barista called out a name, someone stepped forward to take their drink. It was him. He didn't react when he saw me. He didn't look surprised. He didn't acknowledge anything at all. He simply took his coffee and moved aside like this was exactly where he expected to be at that moment. I felt a faint tightening in my chest that I dismissed immediately. Cities are small, routines overlap, coincidences happen. They just don't usually feel like this. After that, it kept happening. Not constantly, not daily, just often enough that the pattern stayed one step behind certainty. A bookstore I ducked into because it started raining. A movie theater I chose because everything else was sold out. A grocery store across town I went to because my regular one was closed for renovations. He was never entering as I arrived. He was never leaving as I did. He was always already there. The interactions were brief and forgettable on purpose. A nod, a glance, once a comment about how busy the place was. He never asked questions, never lingered, never followed me out. That was the part that made it harder to justify feeling uneasy. There was no pursuit, no pressure, no repetition I could point to and say, "This is wrong." Until he spoke. It happened at the downtown library, a place I went to maybe once every few months. I'd chosen it late in the afternoon because I needed somewhere quiet and air-conditioned, nothing more. I'd been sitting near the windows for about 10 minutes when he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down like the seat had been waiting for him. He didn't lower his voice when he spoke. He didn't whisper. "Music," he said it conversationally, almost warmly. "You always sit near windows." I laughed before I could stop myself because that sentence alone didn't feel dangerous yet. I said something about liking natural light. He nodded like that confirmed something, then added, "You don't usually decide where you're going until the last minute, though." That was when my stomach dropped. I asked him what he meant. He didn't pause. He said, "I choose based on convenience first, mood second, and avoidance third." He said it casually, like he was describing traffic patterns or weather shifts. He said, "People who think they're spontaneous tend to follow tighter habits than planners because planners allow for disruption and spontaneous people don't." I told him he was being weird. He smiled, music, not defensively, not mockingly, just calmly. He said he knew. He said that was why he hadn't said anything until now. I stood up and left immediately. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't look back. I walked until my legs felt shaky and got into my car. That night, I replayed every place I'd seen him, every choice I thought had been random. He hadn't been tracking me in the way I understood tracking. He'd been predicting me. Over the next week, I tried to break it. I planned everything in advance. I went places I didn't feel like going. I stayed home when I wanted to leave. I ignored impulses deliberately, forcing myself to choose the less convenient option every time. For a while, it worked. Then I walked out of my gym one evening and saw him leaning against the wall across the street, stretching his calves like he'd just finished a music workout. He looked almost relieved when he saw me. "You're trying too hard now," he said. I told him to leave me alone. I told him this was harassment. I told him I'd call the police if he kept showing up. He listened without interrupting, then said something that finally made me understand why none of my fear had fit properly until then. "I'm not interested in you the way you think," he said. When I demanded an explanation, he gave me one. He said he studies decision-making in people who believe they're acting freely. He said most stalking is emotional and inefficient, built on proximity and obsession. He said that kind of following creates noise. What he does removes it. He told me he chooses people who trust their instincts because instincts are easier to map than plans. He said I wasn't a target. I was a model. That was the reason. Not attraction, music, not fixation, not control, practice. And as he walked away, leaving me standing there with the full weight of what he just said, I understood something that made my chest feel hollow. I would never again be sure whether a choice was mine. I didn't go home after that conversation. I sat in my car in the gym parking lot with the engine off, hands resting uselessly on the steering wheel, trying to slow my breathing while my mind kept replaying the same thought over and over. If he wasn't following me, then staying put didn't make me safer. Movement didn't either. Every option felt pre-selected somehow, like I was choosing between doors that had already been measured. For the next few days, I lived deliberately wrong. I took routes that made no sense. I went to stores I didn't like, neighborhoods I had no reason to be in, music, restaurants that annoyed me just to prove I could. I forced decisions early, planned hours in advance, music, ignored my instincts on purpose, and for a while, the world felt quieter. I didn't see him. I started telling myself I'd scared him off, that whatever experiment he thought he was running had ended. The relief didn't last. It broke on a Thursday evening when I stepped into a hardware store across town. I hadn't planned to be there. My sink had started leaking unexpectedly, and I grabbed my keys and drove without thinking. I was halfway down the first aisle when I felt that same subtle pressure in my chest, the sensation that had started all of this. I looked up. He was standing near the end of the aisle, comparing two identical packages like he was deciding between them. When he noticed me, he didn't smile this time. He looked disappointed. "You defaulted," he said quietly, like he was noting a data point. I snapped. I told him to leave me alone. I told him this was obsession. I told him he was sick. People nearby glanced over, curious, but not alarmed. He lowered his voice and said something that chilled me more than anything else he'd said so far. "You don't understand," he said. "I'm not predicting places. I'm predicting correction." He explained it then fully because there was no point pretending anymore. He said everyone believes they'll act differently when circumstances change, but most people don't. They correct back toward comfort, familiarity, efficiency. He said the more stress you add, the tighter the pattern gets. He said my attempt to behave randomly had been predictable in itself because people who distrust their instincts eventually panic and revert. He told me he chose people who, music, believed in independence, people who trusted their gut, people who would never think to distrust their own decision-making process until it was too late. I asked him why. Why me? Why anyone? He didn't hesitate. He said he'd once been wrong about someone, badly wrong. He said he misjudged how far unpredictability could stretch under pressure and someone else paid for it. He didn't give details. He didn't need to. He said accuracy mattered to him now. He said he needed to know where the breaking point really was. I told him I was calling the police. He nodded. He said I should. He said that would also fit the pattern, and it did. I reported everything, the appearances, the comments, the conversations. The police listened, wrote it all down, and told me there was nothing actionable. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't followed me. He hadn't trespassed. He hadn't done anything illegal. One officer suggested maybe I just crossed paths with someone who shared similar habits. That was the most terrifying part. He wasn't invisible because he was careful. He was invisible because what he was doing looked normal from the outside. I never saw him again after that report. No sudden relief, no sense of victory, just absence. And absence felt worse because now I couldn't tell if the experiment had ended or if I'd simply been dismissed as complete. Weeks passed, then months. My life resumed, but it never fully returned to the shape it had before. I still make decisions. I still act on impulse sometimes. But now there's a pause before every choice. A moment where I ask myself whether this feels right because it's right or because it's easy. I don't trust that pause either. The ending is simple. If you need one, he didn't hurt me. I wasn't attacked. Nothing dramatic happened. But I lost something anyway. Because once you understand how predictable you are, once you realize someone can stand still and still arrive before you, the world stops feeling like a place you move through freely. It starts feeling like somewhere you're expected. And I don't think that feeling ever goes away.